Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. About a month ago, I released a video called Does Henzie Torre Work?, where I pointed out how the wording and rules of Magic at the time did not allow this card to function as it was obviously intended to. This video proved immensely popular, gathering thousands of views, easily reaching my most viewed video of this year so far. And today, I'm taking it down. Why? Because I take my job as a pedagogical resource very seriously, and this is my standard practice anytime Wizards changes the rules so that information from one of the videos I put out is inaccurate. So today, I wanted to take some time to talk about exactly what the issue was, how Wizards fixed it, and if I can see any potential problems that might come up down the road because of that. Ready? Let's get started. So what's the problem? Well, if you take a look at the way that Henzie Torre is worded, you'll notice something kind of interesting, which is that it gives blitz to spells that you play. Now, this is certainly a necessary condition. I mean, it certainly wouldn't work if you didn't have blitz as a spell, because how would you play the spell for its blitz cost otherwise? But it turns out that this actually is not a sufficient condition. And here's why. As you can see here from this passage in the comprehensive rules, blitz is an ability that functions both on the stack and on the battlefield. So if we had something that gave blitz to a creature, we would need it to give blitz to a creature both when it was on the stack as a spell and when it was on the battlefield as a permanent. Because Henzie Torre only does one of those, we're not going to get the full effects of blitz. As you can see here, the thing that gives blitz creatures haste and the thing that lets you draw a card when the blitz creature dies, both of those rely on the blitz creature having that ability while it's on the battlefield. If we were to somehow cast a blitz spell and then have it lose blitz after it stopped being a spell and started being a permanent, well, then we would not have any way to get those benefits. Interestingly enough, it turns out that the thing that makes you sacrifice the blitz card at end of turn is actually a triggered ability that gets set up in the game and not on the creature at the time when you cast the spell for its blitz cost. In other words, because of the way blitz is worded in the comprehensive rules, it turns out that this part of the blitz ability is actually not dependent on the creature having blitz while it's on the battlefield. So this means that when we have Henzie Torre giving blitz to just the spell and not the permanent, then we're going to end up in this kind of perverse situation where you get all the drawbacks of a blitz card, but none of the benefits. So that's the problem. Now, before I go on to what Wizards did to fix it, I want to take some time to address a couple of things that I think people might be confused about. Certainly when I took a look at the comments on my original video, there was a lot of common points that people seemed to think would make it so that this card actually would work the way that it was intended as originally worded. And one of the first things that I'll talk about is actually probably one of the more common complaints that I saw, which is that, hey, if you take a look at Henzie Torre, it specifically says right on the card that it does work. It says right in that text there that the card that you blitz does get haste and it does get the ability that lets you draw a card when it dies. So definitely you should be thinking about that, right? And okay, now that is a very interesting point. However, there's one serious problem with that line of reasoning. And what that problem is that any text that appears like that in parentheses and italics, well, that would be reminder text. And as the name suggests, the only thing reminder text does is it reminds you of how the rules work. It's not actually binding rules text, and the game doesn't actually consider it at all when it's deciding exactly what happens. Now, usually reminder text, it does a pretty good job, and it generally is pretty accurate. But if you're talking about a ruling like this one that depends very sensitively on the exact wording of exactly what's going on, you really need to look in the comprehensive rules to get that wording, because that's where the authoritative version of whatever the card says is actually going to be found when you're dealing with these keyword abilities. So that's the first thing. The next objection that I seemed to get a lot of is actually a little bit more technical, and it has to do with this rule right here. As you can see, if you've got an effect that gives an ability to something that lets it be cast, then that effect is still going to be giving that ability to the spell that that object becomes after it is cast. And at first, it kind of looks like this seems like it should be applicable here. After all, we definitely do have an ability, Blitz, that is letting this Blitz card get cast. However, if you take a look, you'll notice that it only applies to giving that ability to the object after it moves from wherever it is before it got played to the stack. it doesn't say anything about what happens to that spell after it resolves and leaves the stack. It only says that it will get that ability that lets it be played while it's on the stack. Now, of course, we already know that Henzie Torre does give the Blitz ability to the creature that you're casting with Blitz while it's on the stack. Henzie Torre itself specifically says that it gives Blitz to spells, that is, objects on the stack. However, it does not say anything about what would happen after the spell resolves and goes onto the battlefield. And as you recall from our earlier discussion, that's exactly when we would need the Blitz ability to have all the benefits of it. This rule does not say that we would be able to keep that Blitz ability when we move from the stack to the battlefield. Rather, it says that we would be able to keep that Blitz ability when we move from whatever zone it was on onto the stack, and that's not really applicable here. Now, the final thing that I wanted to bring up is another rule that seems like it might be applicable to this situation, but it turns out that it actually was not. That rule that I'm talking about is right here. As you can see, if you have the effect of a resolving spell, activated ability, or triggered ability that changes the characteristics of a spell on the stack, then those characteristics are going to be changed the same way on the permanent that that spell becomes. Now, again, this looks extremely promising because we've got exactly the same sort of thing that we need to have happening here. We have the Blitz ability being granted to a spell on the stack. And what we want is we want the Blitz ability to be on the permanent that that spell becomes. And that's exactly the sort of thing that this rule is talking about. The problem this time is that the thing that is causing the change in the spell's characteristics is not a resolving spell or an activated ability or a triggered ability. Henzie Torre does not use any of those things to give the Blitz ability to the spell that you're casting. Rather, it affects this by a static ability, which is, of course, not one of the things that are specifically called out in that rule. Because of that, this sentence that we talked about is not applicable, and it will not allow the Blitz ability to carry over from the spell onto the permanent, which is what we're hoping for. However, this is where we get to the point where Wizards actually changed the rules to make Henzie Torre work. If you take a look at the current version of that text on the CR, you'll notice that they added an additional sentence that does apply to stuff like Henzie Torre, where a static ability is giving an ability that lets you cast the spell, which is of course something that Blitz is. And so therefore, this specific rule allows the Blitz ability to carry over from when we cast the spell on the stack to when that permanent is on the battlefield. And the Henzie Torre will continue to give Blitz to the permanents that those spells become because of the specific sentence that Wizards added to this rule right here. Really awesome, right? So, what does this mean? It means that if you were to cast a spell using Blitz that you got with Henzie Torre, then after that spell resolves, it's going to continue to have Blitz, in other words, the ability that lets it be cast that it got via a static ability, and while it is on the battlefield, it will still have Blitz because of that effect, and therefore you will have all of the stuff that Blitz does working exactly as it's supposed to. Awesome. Now, when I made my original video, I talked a little bit about some of the possible ways that Wizards could have fixed this issue. I specifically talked about this as one of the possible solutions, but if you remember, I was kind of down on this one, and I wasn't really advocating for this being the one that they would pick. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why this was and what potential problems we might see with this being the text that we have. Alright, so the real root of the problem that I have with this being the fix is that it's kind of philosophically inelegant. Now, I will admit that by itself, this doesn't really constitute a great reason to be against this specific fix. However, I will point out that this definitely is something that could come up. And it certainly is a consideration, even if it by itself is not a really solid reason. So, in order to understand exactly why I feel this way, let's remember that the Magic the Gathering Comprehensive Rules is an extremely long and complicated rules document. And if you don't have some sort of philosophical overarching theme that you are always pulling back to anytime you change that document, well, it's gonna end up getting a little bit messy soon. Anybody who has a programming background definitely knows exactly what I'm talking about. And if you make a kludgy fix every time something doesn't work out exactly the way you want, then eventually you will end up with an unupkeepable mass of spaghetti code that breaks anytime you throw something even a little bit out of the ordinary at it. I'm really afraid that if we have fixes like this going on in the Magic the Gathering comprehensive rules that seem a little bit inelegant, that's the sort of path that I don't want to go down. And so that's the reason why I think that philosophical elegance is definitely an ideal that we need to strive for anytime we're making any sort of change to Magic the Gathering's comprehensive rules, especially one that we need to make in order to make one specific card do exactly what that one card is supposed to do. Anytime we make a band-aid fix that changes the rules for one specific card, we're opening the door to a whole kind of can of worms anytime we might make a similar card in the future that we expect to work a little bit differently. So, with that being said, are there any specific examples that I can point to of things that might not work exactly the way that we're expecting them to with this change? And there are a couple that I thought of that I don't think are probably the way that people expect them to work. The first one that I'll point out is that Henzie Torre gives Blitz to all of your creature spells. And ordinarily that's not going to be a problem because, lots of creatures have Blitz. And if you play a Blitz card using its normal mana cost, well, it'll just enter the battlefield and be a normal creature, and none of the stuff that Blitz does is going to be active because you didn't pay the Blitz cost. Now, that's alright, but the issue is that Henzie Torre is giving Blitz to all of the creatures that you play, whether you're using the Blitz cost or not. And so what that means is, because of the way this rule is worded, we're going to have the Blitz ability being granted to all of our spells on the stack, and because it fits the criteria that this exception is talking about, that means that all of our spells that we play with Henzie Torre that have the appropriate type of mana cost are going to have the Blitz ability on the battlefield, whether we cast them or not. Now, again, them having the Blitz ability on the battlefield isn't a super big deal because, the Blitz ability only is going to do stuff if you paid the Blitz cost. But the fact that these cards have an ability now when they're on the battlefield, even though you didn't take advantage of the Henzie Torre to cast them with Blitz, well, I would say that's kind of non-intuitive. And it definitely does have some implications on the game state if you were, for example, relying on those creatures to not have any abilities, like with a Muruganda Petroglyphs. Because the creatures that you cast with Henzie Torre out are going to have Blitz on the stack, that's changing the characteristics of that spell while it's on the stack with a static ability that gives it a cost. Well, that exact thing is exactly what we need in order to have that carry over to the permanent that spell becomes on the battlefield. Let's note that static abilities that change the characteristics of the spell in other ways, for example, something that gave affinity for artifacts to all of the spells that you played, well, those don't fit under the very specific wording that this rule singles out. And so that means that those effects would actually not carry over onto the permanents that those spells became. So if, for example, you had something that gave all of your spells affinity for artifacts, well, those permanents are not going to have affinity for artifacts when they're on the battlefield. The fact that those two things are so similar and they end up working a little bit differently is, in my opinion, a little bit counterintuitive. Another, and I think probably even more likely to show up situation that I think probably doesn't work exactly the way a lot of people would expect would happen if you were to play a removal spell against the Henzie Torre. So let's say that I'm going to play a blitzed creature with Henzie Torre's ability giving it Blitz, and before I get to attack with that creature, you play a removal spell against Henzie. So what happens there is that the continuous effect that generates the static ability that gives Blitz to my creature, well, that was associated with Henzie Torre being on the battlefield. Once Henzie Torre leaves the battlefield, all of its abilities are going to stop working, and there's not going to be any static ability anymore that wants to give Blitz to the creature that I had played. And so that means we ended up in exactly the same situation that we started out in, where the creature doesn't have Blitz anymore on the battlefield. Just like we talked about before, what that means is that the creature will stop having haste, and it will stop having the ability that lets you draw a card when it dies. However, the thing that makes you sacrifice that creature at end of turn, that was already set up as part of the resolution of the Blitz spell, and that is still going to make you sacrifice that Blitz creature at end of turn, even though it doesn't have Blitz anymore. If you'd like a little bit of more information about exactly how and why that works the way it does, I'd recommend taking a look at this video in the card on the link at the top of your screen. So it turns out that that's not actually even the end of it. If you had some sort of a flicker effect that you played against the Henzie Torre rather than a removal spell, you would actually end up with exactly the same situation. When the Henzie Torre leaves the battlefield, that's going to mean that it turns into a new object with no memory of its previous existence. So that means that the static ability that was granting the blitz ability to the creature spell you played is no longer going to be around. The Henzie Torre that left the battlefield is the thing that was causing that static ability. Even though Henzie Torre re-enters the battlefield as the exact same physical piece of cardboard, as far as the game is concerned, it's a completely new object with no connection to that old Henzie Torre. And so that means that the static ability that's giving blitz to all your creature spells now is a completely different static ability from the one that was giving the blitz ability to the spell that you played. Because the old Henzie Torre is the one that was giving blitz to the creature that you played, that means that is the static ability the game would need to see in order to be giving blitz to the creatures as permanents. Because the new Henzie Torre did not give any abilities to the creature spell that you played, it's not going to be applying to any of the permanents that you had played before it got blinked. Kind of counterintuitive, right? The Henzie Torre that's now on the battlefield is a completely new object, which means that its static ability is not going to apply to the creature that you had blitzed out. And again, we end up in that exact same situation that we had when we played the removal spell against the Henzie Torre. Again, I'm pretty sure most people would not expect that to be the case. And the only way that I could think of that would make it so that that interaction worked out a little bit more sensibly would be to make it so that all of the effects of blitz, the thing that makes you sacrifice at end of turn, the thing that gives haste, and the thing that gives the ability that lets you draw a card when the creature dies, if all of those were rolled into that triggered ability that resolves when you play a blitz spell using its blitz cost. Now, that was one of the things that I had talked about in my other video as a potential solution. However, that has another drawback too. That being that this would actually result in some functional changes to how the blitz ability interacts with some other stuff, such as, for example, dress down and other types of effects that remove abilities from cards. And that's not a great situation either. Like I pointed out in my original video, this is a really thorny issue, and I couldn't come up with any solutions that I thought was a real winner. All of the things that I could think of that would fix the original issue that I alluded to had some sort of a drawback that made it not ideal. All of this goes to show exactly how much work Wizards has to put in to make our game working exactly the way people think it should, and to make it so that people who don't have a PhD level knowledge of Magic's rules are able to still play the game at a functional level 99% of the time. This specific corner case situation ended up being a really thorny issue, but I for one think it's really awesome that Wizards actually cares enough about this game and the rules being consistent to fix stuff like this when it comes up. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.